this 90-minute event.
Today's program, Before the Fall, From the Roaring Twenties to the Crash of '29, is part of our Byron Wien lecture series on financial history. I'd like to thank Mr. Wien, as always, for his great guidance, for his generous support of this institution over many, many years, even before my arrival at the New York Historical Society, and for leading today's program as moderator. The program will last an hour and a half, and it will include a question and answer session. Audience members, as always, will be invited to approach standing microphones in the left and right aisles. We do this so that everyone in the audience can hear your question and the speakers on the stage can hear it as well. I'd like to note that books by our speakers are available in our museum store. You can purchase them following the program. There will, however, not be a book signing this morning. We are so very thrilled that our great trustee, Jim Grant, is back with us this morning for today's program. Mr. Grant is not only a New York Historical Society trustee, but also the founder and editor of Grant's Interest Rate Observer, a twice-monthly journal of the investment markets. He began his career in journalism in 1972 at the Baltimore Sun. He joined the staff of Barron's in 1975, where he originated the Current Yield column. He's the author of numerous books on finance and financial history, including Bernard Baruch, The Adventures of a Wall Street Legend, and Mr. Market Miscalculates. His writing has also appeared in various periodicals, including the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Foreign Affairs. We're also delighted to welcome back to the New York Historical Society Amity Shlaes. She's the director of the George W. Bush Institute's Economic Growth Project. Ms. Shlaes also teaches economic history in the MBA program at the Stern School of Business at NYU. She's written for Bloomberg, the Financial Times, and the Wall Street Journal, where she was an editorial board member, as well as for The New Yorker, Fortune, and Foreign Affairs. Ms. Shlaes is also a columnist for Forbes and the author of, most recently, Coolidge, a comprehensive biography of America's 30th president. Her book, The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression, was named by the Wall Street Journal as one of the best books to read during the financial crisis. Our moderator this morning is Byron R. Wien, the Vice Chairman of Blackstone Advisory Partners, LP, where he acts as Senior Advisor to both the firm and its clients in analyzing economic, social, and political trends. Prior to joining Blackstone, Mr. Wien was Chief Investment Strategist for Pequot Capital and Chief U.S. Investment Strategist at Morgan Stanley for 21 years. In 2006, Mr. Wien was named one of the 16 most influential people on Wall Street by New York Magazine. And in 2008, he was presented with a Lifetime Achievement Award by the New York Society of Security Analysts. As always, before we begin our program, I ask that you please switch off anything that makes a noise, like a cell phone. Our official photographer, New York Historical Society photographer, is here, and he's the only one who's allowed to take photographs this morning. And now, please do join me in welcoming our speakers to the stage.
Okay, so I asked myself this morning, why are 316 people coming to hear us? And I came up with the following answer. They all want to know whether the period we're living through right now is going to be like the 1920s, and it's going to be followed by the 1930s, so that a decade from now, none of us will be able to afford a ticket to come in and hear people like us talk. So I thought we might start out by asking each of you to describe the context in the post-World War I, remember the war to end all wars, period. What was America like in 1920? What were the attitudes of the people? What were the historical forces? And we'll explore whether or not there's some parallels between that period and the decade we're currently living through. Amity, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Byron. The period after World War I was a troubled, challenged period. There was inflation, but the government was not acknowledging it. There was great labor unrest. The soldiers had come back from Europe and seen the revolutions there and thought maybe there should be some revolution here. There was unemployment. There were shortages. You remember Herbert Hoover was food administrator at the end of the war. So there were, there was an expectation that the war had been a boom and things might get worse. In my Coolidge book, I describe how Coolidge, as governor, faced a wicked police strike, that policemen deserved more money. The police stations had rats who chewed on the policemen's helmets, but the strike left the city of Boston in chaos, and Coolidge, as governor, had to call out the guard. That was not unusual for American cities just after the war. The same thing happened in Seattle. So the question is, what will policymakers do in the context of this? By the way, prices, part of that inflation, were up quite a bit, so the policemen couldn't afford what they needed. Think about it that way. You have a disrupted situation, an uncertain future, but also some confidence because we won the war.
Jim?
I have very vivid memories of 1920. You know, Amity, if memory serves, which it does ever so infrequently, but this might be true, I think the Boston police had not had a raise since about 1880. Now, such was the stability of the dollar that this was not thought to be so unusual until the great inflation that followed the Great War. There had been inflations before, but never an inflation in a country in which the currency was defined as a fixed weight of gold. So this was an anomaly, and it was a troubling one. As anomalous as the inflation was the very fact that it had followed a war. On form, what followed wars were deflations. That had happened after the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, and it happened after the War of 1812 in this country. There had been a deflationary period after the Civil War in this country. So coming out of 1918, people were set up for a bust. And lo and behold, as so often happens in finance, expectations were confounded. And there was a great inflationary boom. And some prospered and some didn't. Some were resentful, like the Boston police, and some were giddy, like the speculators. And then come 1920, when it was not expected, came the deflationary bust. And of course, there was no press release announcing its arrival. These things come stealthily. And only after the cyclical event did the official scorekeepers determine that January 1920 was the peak of that inflationary cycle. And what followed was a bust that bottomed, again, according to subsequent soundings by the National Bureau of Economic Research, in the summer of 1921. So it was an 18-month depression. Unscripted, but it happened.
Can you just talk to us a little bit about what was going on in Europe at the time and whether that was having an influence? I'm thinking about the Weimar, I'm thinking about the German repatriation obligations. Did that have any impact on the U.S. at that time?
Oh, yes, indeed. It had been a world war, and neither Amity nor I nor Byron has mentioned that more lethal than the war was the influenza pandemic. There was an economist named Thomas Gregory who, in about 1920, pronounced that the world was in the worst shape it had ever been in.
It's always in the worst shape.
Right, right. That's an economist for you.
Yeah, right. Right.
But certainly, I mean, Europe was in such a bad way. I guess that is chronically the case. But yes, it was a world of sin and sorrow and troubles.
I think we could add, to give you the political context, there was a new movement that looked like the future, the progressive movement, and it wanted more health care, for example. It wanted to nationalize utilities, which were the engine of economic growth. Everyone could see what electricity would be to that decade, the 20s. And it was small, but on the march. It had momentum. It was really an offshoot of the Republican Party. It divided the Republican Party, as we'd seen, back in the past with Bull Moose. So people thought, well, maybe the progressives will win in the 20s. The Democrats, that was Wilson, people were tired, and the Republicans were split. So that's where it all was. And therefore, how you campaign in 1920 in either party or the Progressive Party, that was a tough decision. The Republican Party, in the end, in 1920, decided to go hard. They weren't squishy.
What does that mean?
What does that mean? They said it was farther to the right or more conservative than a lot of people had expected. People thought of Republicans as progressives. The best way you encapsulate it is Warren Harding's inaugural address when he did win as the hard Republican. He said, no more experiments. All we need is, the best thing is, efficient administration of our current system. No wild, dreamy projects. It's very different from what either party would say today, because it's just political rule that whatever party you're in, you're supposed to be fun, energetic, and talk about new products and change. So no change. And when you think about what Harding, Coolidge being his vice presidential candidate at that time, campaigned on, they campaigned on normalcy. That's a terrible word. When you hear normalcy in high school, right, and there it is on you're racing through history, your junior year, right? What does normalcy sound like? Oh, they wanted normalcy after the war. They wanted everyone to be normal and stupid, right? We're intellectual and clever and different. But when I went back and looked at what it was for the Coolidge book, and I know Jim can talk about this too, I found they meant something different. They said, we want the political economy, the market, or politics to work within certain normal parameters so we can have less economic uncertainty and have more fun. Starting companies, for example, and Coolidge was a stickler for English. He didn't really like that word normalcy. He thought maybe Harding wasn't using it appropriately. So Coolidge just said, our campaign in 1920 is for less economic uncertainty. That pleased him better.
Something else that was very much in the foreground of this time was, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And this informed the politics of America as it did of Europe. There's a terrific sense of excitement on the part of the progressives in Seattle. It was a general strike in Seattle, the first general strike in America, along about 1920. People thought this might be the next big thing. And, looking back, we can see that it was not the next big thing, certainly for America. Well, it was indeed a big thing for many generations, but it was not America's cause. But at the time, it was not so certain. Citibank had, Frank Vanderlip, the president of Citibank, had this thought that Russia was going to be a terrific opportunity. And he put branches all over Russia. And, and not for the first time did the Citibank.
Go ahead.
Go right down.
So I think Russia then is as China has been now. We don't know, or maybe 10 years ago, they didn't really know what would happen in Russia, but the scale of it appealed to them. To people who like the economy of scale, a big project is always better. Wow, how many time zones was Russia? How many Fords, and you think of Ford Motor Company was in there too, made tractors. How many Fords can you sell there? What that market is. And nobody knew yet what would become of Bolshevik Russia. So you can't be as hard on them as you might be, because we didn't know. And it divided up. Many companies were excited about Russia. Some politicians didn't like Russia. Some didn't know what to make of it. Herbert Hoover was disgusted with the Bolshevik Revolution because he had businesses there that were trashed by the revolutionaries, and they broke delicate mechanisms for ceramics that he had, his companies were trashed. But other politicians thought, well, maybe we should have at some point relations with Russia. We don't now, because they are so big and because they are such a market.
Well, and companies bid for the concessions to do
Right.
that. I've always thought that there was kind of a transcendental soft issue that colored a decade. And in the 1920s, it was Prohibition. You know, I think that that really had an impact on the American spirit. I know it had an impact on my parents. They were thinking about having a kid all during the 1920s, but they didn't have me until Prohibition was repealed. They weren't going to bring a kid into the world who couldn't drink when he got home. Did Prohibition influence the country at all? Did it affect the American spirit the way I think it did?
Certainly would have affected my spirits. You know, in my reading and study of the early 20s, I thought, okay, I read Daniel, I think, Ockrent's book, Last Call, which is a terrific social and partially an economic history of Prohibition. And you know, the consolidated, if you can think of the consolidated industry of bars, saloons, breweries, distribution networks, distillers, it was a not inconsiderable portion of the 1920 GNP. So at a stroke, the government says no more. And that surely must have had some macroeconomic, a word we ought to come back to because then it didn't exist, but it ought to have some comprehensive effect on American enterprise. But I can't find the evidence for it, and I think so much of what had happened above ground went, as it were, below ground, that I think the economic effects of Prohibition were rather muted.
Amity, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, Coolidge took a pragmatic approach. His father suggested he be a pharmacist, which meant someone who gave out licensed liquor, and he thought that was a little tacky. I think many people thought the whole Prohibition story was a bother, and that they didn't like the way when people break the law, that erodes the rule of law. That was his position. For example, he was of counsel to a brewery. One of the ways he made money was through liquor, and the town where he worked, I'm just using this president as an example, Northampton, Massachusetts, was a licensed town. That meant they could sell liquor. Remember, there was Prohibition before Prohibition in American towns and cities. They could be dry or wet. And so he just thought it was a bother, as did Andrew Mellon, whose wife took delivery of liquor off boats that would come in to the cottages on Rhode Island, right? It was a bother. It cost a lot of money for the Coast Guard to police this. You can see it in the Treasury budget in the 20s. I would say, because we have television and boardwalk and so on, Prohibition looms large, and because of our own marijuana debates, I don't really see it deeply being the story of the 20s. More likely, I like the Ockrent book very much that Jim mentioned, but I also like Middletown, the book by two sociologists studying Muncie, Indiana. And if you read that book, it's all about the excitement of the decade for people, and most of it isn't about liquor. It's about getting an automobile. So if you want to say what happened in the 20s, I think the automobile was a bigger story, say, than liquor.
Well, yeah, but there was one aspect of Prohibition. It really did encourage some people to deviate from the law, to go to speakeasies and that sort of thing. There was an overlay of immorality that did pervade society at that time. And
you know what else was part and parcel of that somewhat cynical attitude towards the law was the federal income tax. Had the same effect on many people. In a conventional business transaction, there is a buyer and a seller, and you know one, you're the other. You shake hands. There is it's a voluntary transaction. Now comes the income tax, and it is no longer voluntary. It's compulsory. It is a degree. There's something about it that got under the skin of many Americans. And they came to see that it was a little bit all right to trim and to hedge and to indeed cheat. And Frank Sullivan's what's the title of this? His multi-volume history of the Our Times, I think. Anyway, Frank Sullivan is it Frank Sullivan, audience?
Mark
Sullivan, thank you. Mark Sullivan has a wonderful couple of pages on the effect of the new income tax on Americans' attitudes towards the law. And it was, I think, so it very much reminds me of your observations on prohibition.
And that relates, I mean, if you look, what was the income tax was a young fellow in this period. It's from the teens, the federal income tax, right? And it started around 6 or 7, and it went up into the 70s all of a sudden. People didn't like that change. It was too fast. Nobody was quite sure about the treatment of capital gains that was being adjudicated. So if the courts weren't sure, you shouldn't be necessarily so sure in your firm whether you would pay that cap gains tax. Well, dividends were, I believe, untaxed, but this was also had to be remained to be clarified formally. Well, that's an awful lot of uncertainty, and you had the feeling that the other party, just as Jim and Byron are saying, the government wasn't so sure itself about this levy.
Right.
And so, therefore, you weren't so sure about the government and its requirements for it. You go back, and Andrew Mellon, the Treasury Secretary, much money flowed to liquor, and much money flowed to another almost illicit place, into municipal bonds. That is to say, it flowed where it wouldn't otherwise flow, into municipal bonds, because municipal bonds were very attractive due to the high marginal tax rate. Mellon didn't like this. And he didn't think the cities needed, the Treasury Secretary, just think of the discussion, the cities really needed this much money, and maybe they weren't building very productive things with all the money they were getting. So he tried to get up an amendment to the Constitution, there were more of those in those days, to ban the special status of the municipal bond. Well, it didn't go over very well, especially with the top marginal rate being in the 70s. So he said, I'm going to address this problem another way. I'm going to reduce the income tax rate so that the relative attractiveness of the municipal bond is reduced, narrow the spread. And it worked like a charm. If you look at the charts, they did cut the income tax on the theory that lower taxes are better, on the theory they get more money, but also on the theory that people would pay taxes that were more reasonable. So it's an interesting thought process that goes all along through the 20s, and from the 70% top marginal rate, I don't have the chart in front of me, but start with that, down to, in the end, their top marginal rate was 25%, much lower, and sort of permanently so. And a lot of that was not only about economics, but also about establishing political trust.
Well, that was one thing that Mellon and Coolidge had in common. Mellon wanted to cut the taxes because he was the original supply-sider. He thought if taxes were lower, there'd be more investment. Coolidge wanted to cut taxes because he believed, I think, and you know a lot more about Coolidge than I do, he believed that if you starved the government, if there wasn't enough money to run the government, that was a good thing.
Well, this is a wonderful thing, things I was able to discover in this story. Mellon was kind of a social scientist. In a way, he was a progressive. He said, I want to do scientific taxation, and I will lower the rate, and maybe there'll be more activity. I'll get more money, just like Walmart. You lower the price. He didn't say that because that's anachronism, but imagine just like Walmart, you lower the price, you make up profit on the volume of sales. He used a railroad metaphor. He said, you charge in railroad for toll what the traffic will bear. And if the toll is too high, fewer trains come. If you make it lower, maybe you get more money. That's what we would call supply-side economics. Well, Coolidge was a New Englander, much less interested in numbers and much more cautious in temperament. Temperament matters greatly, and he didn't like this idea at all. Because, well, what if you cut the rate and you didn't get more money? Well, then you'd have a deficit, and then the money would go to Europe, and where there would be a recession. But even worse, what if you did get the money? What if you did get that extra money? Well, then the other side would spend it and make the government bigger, which he opposed exactly. Yep. So you imagine someone in agony over this, and he was in agony when he kept seeing the money come in. It was an obscene amount of money, the tax revenues, and he would write it all down, and always the revenues would be a little higher than the president expected. But I like watching him because Coolidge also believed in delegation. He believed that his Treasury Secretary, an important sort of Warren Buffett of the era, a very highly regarded financial figure, knew what he was doing better than Coolidge, who was a lawyer from Massachusetts. Therefore, in the name of delegation, he went along with Mellon. Very interesting relationship.
Jim, do you have any comments on the behavior of the Federal Reserve during this period?
Yes, I do. Yes. Well, the Federal Reserve, like the income tax, like the flu, was a... The Federal Reserve got started in about 100 years ago. 1914 was its first full year of operation, and it was scarcely out of short pants when World War I came, and it financed the war, as central banks do. So come the peace, it hoped it would be allowed to conduct an honest central banking business without subsidizing public finances. And then struck the aforementioned Depression of 1920. And the Fed's conduct during the Depression was most interesting because it was the only episode in the 100 years of operation of our central bank in which the Fed administered interest rate was higher at the bottom of the slump than it had been in the preceding peak of the boom. So consider what it would be like if instead of lowering rates during a recession, the Fed decided it ought to raise them, which is exactly what it did in 1920 and 21. And if you adjusted the ruling money market interest rate for the collapse in prices, the rates at the time were punitively high. There were upwards of 20% as adjusted, so-called real interest rates, 20%. Constricting, strangling. But paradoxically, most interestingly, the Depression ended. It's not going on today, that Depression, which is a story in its own right. But the Fed didn't, and by modern lights, the Fed did a terrible job. You read the historians of the Fed from Milton Friedman on, and they condemn. But by results, you have to wonder whether it didn't work in some mysterious way, because the Depression of 1920-21 turned out not to be a Great Depression. It turned out to be a self-healing depression, which is another story.
Well, but Mellon was pressing the Federal Reserve to raise interest.
No, Mellon was pressing the Federal... The Harding administration comes in March of 1921, and the Depression had been going on, of course, since January of 1920, so it was, 13 or so, 14 months into the slump. So Mellon comes in. Mellon, as Amity indicated, was a terrifically successful, knowing, and intuitive industrialist and financier. He was not just a banker, although he was a banker. He was Alcoa. He was Pittsburgh industry incarnate. And he knew in his bones as well as in his head that interest rates ought to be lower than they were. And he pressed. Then the Secretary of the Treasury was an ex officio member of the Board of Governors of the Fed. So Mellon, in that capacity, used his considerable influence to press the other governors to come along with a program of lower rates and easier money. And that started not soon after Mellon came in March. I think in April and May. Central bank administered interest rates began to fall, and the Depression ended. It bottomed in July. So Mellon, but Truman, in his memoirs, wrongly recalls Mellon, this hard horse, severe, rather unapproachable figure, as being the symbol of liquidation and constraint and these strangling rates. But on the contrary, Mellon was, in fact, quite sensibly for lower interest rates.
Okay. So staying with the thematic consistency of this discussion, leadership is a big issue today. And it's a little bit about presidential leadership during the 1920s.
Well, it gets to, thank you, it gets to the issue of trust. So remember, 1921, it's Harding, Coolidge. And Harding was for this, his brain said, let's cut the government. They also cut the government quite a bit. The Democrats before them, right, let's cut the government. Let's say no to a lot of things. The party plan said no, no, no. Let's say no to everything. But Harding, by temperament, and temperament matters, is the kind of guy who says yes. And unfortunately, he said yes once too often. He hired his friends all the time, so he made errors. So we had a worthy privatization project that the Reason Foundation would feature on the cover of its magazine today. Western oil reserves of government need to be privatized. And instead of the way he conducted it, however, it ended up not being a worthy casebook privatization project. It ended up being Teapot Dome. Scandal, because friends got favors instead of people benefiting. He did a worse thing vis-a-vis the vets. They were going to build hospitals for the vets. They had quite an expensive plan for that. It was a compromise with the veterans. Remember, the veterans were a much bigger group in that time. There was universal conscription. Remember, too, there were no antibiotics. And the vets came home in pain and weren't likely to stop being in pain for much of their lives. So they cut this big compromise hospitals for you, and those were corrupt too, and the man Harding put in there ended up in Leavenworth Prison. So Harding blew it, and he blew trust. The vets didn't trust the government anymore. The people knew that rich people kept the oil. That's what Teapot Dome said. And Harding died, I think, of his own inconsistency, very sadly, in the summer of '23 of a kind of stroke. And Coolidge comes in, and Coolidge's job, his number one job, he sort of sounds like Lyndon Johnson, is to execute our party program, quote unquote, to perfection. And he kept every cabinet member, even the suspect ones, but he concentrated entirely on serving as a president to build up trust. He thought that trust was very important. And when you look at the Coolidge family, you'll see he was quite dramatic about it. Everyone went to the Harding White House for what the Washington Post called food and action. They were violating prohibition over there for sure. Coolidge White House was all of a sudden Vermont breakfast, very cold, almost like a church, right? And with the Coolidge family, you've heard of the Roosevelt children riding up and down the banisters and bringing their ponies in the White House and so on. That reflected their father's idea that this was his house, bully pulpit. The Coolidge children had to respect the presidency, and when John Coolidge, the son of the president, came in the wrong clothes for dinner, he got sent away to put on his formal clothes, because at the White House you wore formal clothes. And when Mrs. Coolidge, this is right down to the family, Mrs. Coolidge wanted to try something new. She wanted to try horseback riding. And Mrs. Coolidge was one of the most beautiful first ladies ever, and she had a great figure. She was the first aerobic first lady. She walked 5 miles a day. And she puts on this habit and looks awfully fetching, and the president says, "You shouldn't do anything. You'll do better if you don't do anything new in this job. No pants, no habits." And this sounds to us cold and cruel, but what it was Coolidge's effort to build up the authority of the office and to show that he was there as a presider, not an autocrat to lead. And I'll just say finally, when he chose not to run again in '28, he could have run again. That, too, was out of respect for office. Like Lord Acton, he believed power corrupts absolutely. And he said from time to time we should change the person in the office, no permanent people, because the office is more important than any individual. So awfully conservative, humble attitude, but much liked by the people.
Okay, well then, in a good academic sense, compare and contrast Coolidge and Hoover.
You want to do that, or you want me to do it?
No, go ahead, Amity, you go on. I've got a whole set of...
I've got it. Well, this is a hilarious story of two different temperaments clashing. They're supposed to both be Republicans, right? Hoover, Coolidge, what's the difference? No, I mean, they're huge, enormous difference. Hoover was Mr. Energy. He was the smartest guy in the room. And we know of Hoover. I just did a wonderful show with George Nash, who's his biographer. He was the best paid young man of his generation. He found the gold in the ground through his engineering skill that made the gold standard work, right? And he had an enormous record as a successful philanthropist. He had a sort of salvation complex. He saved Belgium in World War I, right? He liked to rescue. He went down to the awful flood of the Mississippi in '27 to be the healer for the government. And when he came into the presidency, he wanted to run things. Coolidge did not like him. Coolidge called him Wonder Boy. He said, Oh, that man has given me more advice, all of it wrong, by the way. Hoover had a really irritating habit, we've all worked in big companies, of butting in every department. So they said that he was Secretary of Commerce, where Coolidge and Harding had placed him because he'd be harmless there. Right? What's he going to do? You know, put the fish to bed, right? So turn the lights on, right? They said he was secretary at Commerce and undersecretary everywhere else because he butted in. He often used the press in an irritating way to get his message through, and it just almost came to blows between Coolidge and Hoover. And another time we can talk about the Hoover presidency, but it's of an entirely different style.
So what impact did this have on the country?
Well, not so much. I mean, it was just two guys. One thing I noticed, if you look at the budget in the 20s, the outstanding fact about Coolidge, if you want to take one thing away with him, today we sometimes hope the government will cut the budget. He actually cut the budget. That is to say, when he left office in 29, the federal budget was actually lower than when he came in. You can look it up in the Tax Foundation or National Account charts. Oh, well, how do you do that? Usually we just reduce the increase. I think I see Dr. Hubbard over there, who worked on reducing the increase in modern administrations. So he actually did it. But the one department that grew in the 20s obnoxiously was Commerce. And if you look at the Commerce building architecture, it is a grandiose structure, right? Too big for what it is. Is the federal government supposed to be in charge of Commerce anyway, right? It's private. And that, I'm sure that to shut Hoover up, Coolidge threw him money. Easiest way, right?
Okay, Jim, so now we have a good glimpse into the leadership at the presidency. What was it like in the Treasury and the Federal Reserve? I mean, right now, everybody was for Bernanke's period at the Treasury, everybody at the Federal Reserve, everybody focused on what the Federal Reserve was doing. He was one of the most important people in government. Did the Federal Reserve have that kind of role in the 1920s?
The Federal Reserve in the 20s had mixed but on balance terrific press. This institution came into the world in response to what people thought was the costly and shaming propensity of America to dissolve into financial crisis. Britain had not had really a bank failure since the 1860s, or maybe a little later if you count some of the smaller banks. But Britain was basically a country that got through the day without depositors running on illiquid banking institutions. And in America, it happened time and again, and people wanted done with it. In comes the Fed. December 23rd, 1913, the bill is signed, Woodrow Wilson using a gold pen. And one of the big the drugstore chains runs an ad in the Wall Street Journal. Christmas present to the nation. Federal Reserve, we are through with panics. That was the idea. So comes this depression, 1920, and there is no money panic. Now, the average prices fell by no less than 40%. 40%, a huge deflation. Industrial production down 30%. The stock market peak to trough down almost by half. Unemployment, a lot. There was no real accurate taking of soundings of how many people were unemployed, but the guesses ran from 2 million to 6 million. That's how imprecise the statistics were. So the Fed was the new thing. It was there to liquefy, meaning to infuse with cash banks that needed funds but had good collateral. Collateral meaning loans to solvent institutions, banks, farms, other operating businesses. So the Fed was kind of a star, and then the star became a little bit tarnished because of the continuing collapse in prices. Cotton farmers were desolated. Similarly with row crop farmers of all kinds. Anyone in the mining business similarly bruised and battered. And people looked up and they saw these towering stratospheric interest rates. Fed, please, would you kindly relent? So the Fed star fell a little. But the Depression ended, and the 20s proverbially roared, and the Fed star rose again. And by late in the 20s, people were again of the mind that given the competent attention of this central bank, there was no chance, really no meaningful chance of another 1907 panic. And so people put a lot of store in this institution, and in the people who ran it. Benjamin Strong, of course, was the star central banker of the 20s. He died before the crisis of '29. But the Fed was a very, very big thing in American life.
Well, let's go into the second half of the 1920s. The economy was heating up. There were very low margin requirements in the stock market. The stock market was starting to boil. The inequality issue was becoming even more pronounced. These are similarities to what's going on now. Did anybody see this coming? Did anybody see the 1930s brewing at that time? Did they think that the good times were going to go on forever?
Let me read you, if a witness may refresh his memory with a quick reference. I'm going to read you a quotation from Herbert Hoover's own survey of current business. It was the 100th anniversary of this publication, and it came out in 1929. Let's see. December 1929, 100th edition of the Survey of Current Business said this, quote, "While it may be too early to say that the utilization of business data has entirely eliminated the business cycle, there is agreement today among business leaders everywhere that the wider use of facts will mitigate in a large degree many of the disastrous effects of the one-time recurrent business cycle," close quote. Now, we look at the 20s, I think all of us, in a kind of an anachronous way. We know what happened in the 30s, and knowing that, we look back with a rather jaundiced and cynical and ironic eye on the goings-on of the 20s. But truly, I mean, there was a book produced by Hoover again in 1929. It was called Recent Economic Changes. And it was 2,000 pages of facts, figures, and narrative of the prosperity of the 20s. I mean, these people were not imagining that this was some era. The cost of living rose by less than 1% a year on average. Wages were up on average by almost 3%. Real wages rose. I'm not sure if you mentioned inequality. I don't think this was an issue in the 20s. People were rising in their merits. Growth was booming. One of the quotations in this book is to me so illuminating as to the spirit of the times, as, to be sure, filtered through the well-to-do and the intellectually respectable who produce such narratives. But here is a report on what foreign visitors thought when they came to America in the mid-20s. And the two words that are in quotation marks I find just thrilling. The foreigners invariably remarked on what the authors of this book called the, quote, indomitable hopefulness of Americans. Isn't that great?
It's great.
So what was the mood in the White House?
Well, I want to question, if I may, the premise of your question. Okay. I think what we were hearing was, did they know in the 20s that they would be followed by all this, and maybe there was some causality there. I don't find evidence that the 20s were so bad that they required a 10-year Great Depression. there is evidence that the 20s were so bad they required a severe market crash in 1929, and there is even evidence internationally that we had to have a bad contraction, and we made a bunch of errors, policy errors. But the errors, when you start to get to 33, 34, 35, every year there is a different reason that the recovery chooses to stay away. It's not because of what Andrew Mellon said to Calvin Coolidge. And in the histories we first read when we were younger, say John Kenneth Galbraith, you get that feeling. There's almost no evidence that the whole of 20s policies was so awful and so Gatsby-like that the 30s were necessary. And I just want to add one thing. I think the Gatsby films definitely reinforced this idea. It was all a champagne bubble, wasn't it? Well, you want to remember some facts about Gatsby. Gatsby was written about Jim's depression, because Gatsby was written in the early 20s. It was published in 25. That was the bubble that F. Scott Fitzgerald had in mind. And when, say, a film producer brings in a 1929 car and writes a caption voice says it's all about 29, he's being anachronistic with Fitzgerald. So you want to be careful. You know, look at it in Coolidge's lifetime. Coolidge became an adult graduating from Amherst College in '95, which is about when the Dow Jones Industrial Average started, when it came online. And he saw multiple crashes in his adulthood as a young politician or attorney, including 1907, but others where the market went down as much, I think, as 50%. You can look, I was just all the time, 40%. And there was never any giant 10-year depression after that. So you want to ask yourself, what is it about 29 that made the severity of the early 30s, and was it really causing the entire 30s?
Right. It was in good part the well-intended attempt by the Hoover administration to prevent a depression that I think, and I think Amity might agree with some of this, that put the depth and indeed the greatness into the Great Depression so far as the American experience is concerned. Hoover was, first of all, the Depression of 1920 and 21 was basically a Woodrow Wilson production. And Woodrow Wilson presided over it, but he presided over it in a most passive way. He was incapacitated. He had suffered a stroke, and his administration, too, was incapacitated, and inadvertently he presided over the last laissez-faire depression in America. The government met the very severe conditions of 1920 and 21 by balancing the budget and, through the Fed, by raising interest rates. But it ended. And the recovery in 1922 on was wonderfully dynamic. I mean, there were labor shortages reported in Detroit by late 1921. That is 3 or 4 months after the official trough. Wages fell along with prices. Business profits recovered quickly. And a liquidated market became the magnet for opportunistic capital. And it was a terrific whoosh to the upside. Okay, so fast forward 8 or 9 years. Herbert Hoover, as Amity says, the Assistant Secretary of Everything, sees these thunderheads. Hoover was bearish in the stock market. He saw it coming. What to do after the market crashed? Well, Hoover convened meetings. He wanted America's business leaders to pledge that unlike 1920 and 21, they would not cut wages. The prices fell nonetheless. Wages remained up, and profit margins vanished. There is an economist that Amity and I both are fans of, called Lee Ohanian, who was out in UCLA, I think, and he consults, although not frequently enough, with the Federal Reserve. And
there wasn't, wrong-headed thinking wasn't exclusive to the presidency. I mean, I think margin requirements were 5% at the time. I find a striking parallel between Federal Reserve policy before the 2008-9 collapse and the Great Depression. The Federal Reserve had enormous power to restrain bank leverage, to be much more disciplined in terms of what you could loaning money to people who were buying houses irresponsibly. The Federal Reserve under Alan Greenspan took virtually no action on that. and they could have.
But you know what's the essential difference to me, Byron, is that margin requirements, yeah, were like 10% in 1929, and the Fed could have raised margin requirements certainly in the current regime. I'm not sure it could have legally in 1929. But what was essentially different in the 20s about American finance was the absence of this institution of the socialization of risk. I mean, with deposit insurance as a first policy thrust, and then subsequently with all manner of federal support for the likes of Citicorp and the rest of them, the government came to sit by the elbow of our bankers, and presently it moved in and has virtually become partners. If you walk into one of these too big to fail banks today, you're not sure who is the paid help and who are the federal minders. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of people working inside these banks. It's like the Marine detachments in American embassies. Like, who owns what? There was no such assurance in the 20s. On the contrary, there was every assurance that the owners of the banks owned the problem. There was something called the double liability rule. If you were a stockholder of a nationally chartered bank and that bank became impaired or insolvent, you, the owner, got a capital call. It was your bank, right? You got the dividends. You owned the problem to the downside. So that went away in the mid-30s with the various banking acts under the New Deal. But the absence of the socialization of risk, to me, and of course, in the absence of taxpayer support of a bank, bankers behaved differently. They insisted on liquid assets. They funded themselves more conservatively. They ran capital to asset ratios much higher than the present. Morgan Stanley shows up to work in 2006 and 2007, leveraged 40 to 1. I mean, what has to go wrong for that not to work? Like, nothing, right?
Amity, you want to pile on here?
It's related, but it's not the same. I mean, one thing Jim has worked on, and that you think about the myths you have of this period. What Mellon was evil because what did he say? Like the wicked witch of the West, liquidate, right? And that's portrayed as evil because it's selling something when its price might be very low. But what's behind that is a very legitimate method, which is let the prices clear so you know what they are. Once the market knows what prices are, then it can trade again. And when it's not certain about prices, well, it might hesitate. And one of the great criticisms or suspicions many of us have about the current period and the weak quality of the recession for a long time was nobody knows what the price of a house is, right? Because it's still got 14 subsidies sideways. Nobody knows what it will be tomorrow. Nobody knows what the interest rate will be because that price isn't clearing either. It's deeply politicized. Then the interest rate was less politicized because it was pegged to gold. So that idea tended to work. Whether it was the downturn of 1907 or the downturn of 2021, it was brutal. The market cleared. People lost their shirt. It was their fault. It was terrible. But then the market recovered pretty fast.
May I tempt Byron and the investors in the audience with a glimpse at the bargains on offer at the lows of 1921? Okay. Yeah. Some of the industrial cyclicals, as you might expect, got cheap. I mean, General Motors was at 3.5 times forward earnings at the lows. But what is most striking is how the consumer companies were valued during the liquidation, at the worst of the liquidation. Coca-Cola, there were exactly 500,000 shares outstanding. Very new company, but not so new as to not show its prospects and its possibilities. It was known to be a fabulous enterprise. It was valued at the lows at what would prove to be 1.7 times 1922 earnings and 2.5 times 1923 earnings, and the shares paid a dividend of 5.25. Gillette, safety razor company, which had sold as many razors and blades in 1921 as it had in 1920, as it had in 1919, was quoted a little bit more than 5 times forward earnings. It yielded 9.25%. Radio Corporation of America, not yet revealed as the great growth stock of the 20s, was on offer in the market for about as much as it would earn in 1923, $1.50. So that's what a market looks like when it's not federally manicured.
Well, we're getting toward the end here, and so after listening to both of you during the last hour, I'm a little disturbed that nobody saw the 1930s coming. Nobody thought that it was important to take remedial action until it was probably too late. I know Mellon pushed the Federal Reserve to raise, I guess they raised interest rates of 5% in August 28, and then they pushed them to 6%. But it was kind of too late to do anything. But nobody had any inkling of what was likely to happen. And that's sort of where we are now. Well, what happened in the 30s did happen. And so in your final comments, is what we're seeing now similar to that period in any respect? In other words, should we be apprehensive that the next 10 years could be much more difficult than the last 10 years have been, or the last 5 years have been?
I'm thinking Byron said the interest rate was way too low at 5%. Therefore, they had a terrible crash in Byron's laying out of it.
No, I'm saying that was too late to do.
Right, or too late. So what are we too late? And how high does our interest rate have to go to preclude in this argument 10 years of downturn? What we see now that is like the Great Depression, in my view, is not the market bubble. It's the social policy. And that would be Hoover, who was quite a social redistributor, and then, of course, the Roosevelt administrations and the New Deal. And in that period, through large interventions in the economy, the government scared off business, and the economy didn't get back to where it had been before the crash of '29, in the decades, neither in employment nor in the Dow. So that I am quite concerned about an expansion of the federal government. In addition, even worse is the budget where we are, because they were never that bad in the 30s in terms of the debt or the deficit. Well, not debt, let's say debt. So that idea that social redistribution will bring recovery is a fallacy. It was a fallacy that hurt us in the 30s. And if anything makes our decade dark, that would be that idea.
Okay, Jim, do you want to have any comments?
I would like to welcome, I think that Amelie's remarks were terrific, and I think it's high time for the audience to chime in a question or two.
Oh, all right. So that's an answer. Is it too late?
So you're not worried?
Well, no, I am worried. But one is always, I mean, I will vouchsafe this thought with respect to the future, about which I'm a leading authority on not knowing. I think that America, like Major League Baseball, is basically indestructible, and that try as they might, they can't, and they won't. And I come back to the essential spirit of what they called indomitable hopefulness. And I mean, one sees all manner of policy errors. If you live in the city of New York, you see another crop. Even on the Upper West Side, people are beginning to see some policy errors. Byron, in the War of 1812, the government didn't have the money to buy stationery. So we've been through worse than this, and we have certainly been through better. But I think it's going to be fine in about a few years.
Okay, well, look, I think this issue can be pressed further, but let's press it further. Let's press it further during the question and answer period. I think there are microphones set up in both aisles, the left and right. It's hard for me to see whether anybody's lined up there or not. But if you have a question, approach the microphone, and I'll try to move from side to side, and we'll do the best we can to answer the question. If it's a general question and you don't care who answers it, state it. But if you have a specific person you're interested in hearing his or her views, state that as well. Okay, let's start on this side.
What
Yeah.
role did radio play in the economy and the culture? And was it similar to computerization in the 90s, the effect on the economy?
Yes, the radio. The book I mentioned, The Survey of the 20s, was very keen on the radio as a major contributor to the improvement of American life. And here is a citing from the end of the decade. It said, did this book, it said that, let's see, there are, in 1928, January 1st, 1928, there were 7.5 million radio sets in use. Radio sets is how they put it. Yet about 70% of American homes are still without the radio. And here is the following quote, sir. It says, quote, "We seem only to have touched the fringe of our potentialities." So radio, whatever its significance as a medium of cultural communication, was also a symbol of what people were beginning to call the second industrial revolution. Not only was it here, not only was RCA on the verge of a fabulous, by then it was in manifest great growth stock, but also radio was a reminder of how much still could happen.
Amity?
Well, you think this is very much analogous to the 90s and the internet, especially as regards stock values. You read Radio Corp was so overpriced, right? It was one of the famous ones that was overpriced in 29. I think it's in John Kenneth Galbraith. But as Jim says, some radio companies, including Radio Corp, had an idea that would later become television or more radios, and that idea was indeed profitable and worthy of investment. They just didn't have it in 29. It's very hard when there's a great technology innovation to gauge how much productivity and profit will come from it and at what stage.
Sure.
And the stock market, of course, will go up a lot when that happens. That's one of the things that happened with the internet. Trying to figure out is Google worth something or nothing, ditto Facebook. So that is part of the frothiness of the late 20s and the frothy. What's our invention now, though?
Ray DeVoe tells the story of he was working in a brokerage having Spencer Trask in the mid-'60s, and some guy walks in, some stranger walks in, and he has a package under his arm, and he says, "This is my stock in RCA. I finally broke even."
Okay, from the other side.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for a fruitful seminar. My name is Lee, and my opinion is that, or my question is, what did isolationism play during that period of time in leading up to the Depression? My opinion is that it did affect us a lot. What do you think of that, of isolationism?
Lee, I'm not sure that we were so isolated. The League of Nations was the most contentious political topic of the late teens and early 20s. It poisoned American politics. But I think that America was increasingly knit into the world in other ways. In finance, for example, America was quickly in the 20s took over the role that London had played as a center of world finance. And by the late 20s, for good or ill, you find the Federal Reserve Bank of New York throwing its weight behind lower interest rates to facilitate Britain's adjustment to the post-war world. And some historians, namely Murray Rothbard, or especially Murray Roth, contend that the Fed's subordination of American interest to European interest was a direct cause of the financial troubles that finally came to the fore in 29 and 30. So I think politically there was the contention over the war debt, over the League of Nations. That was audible, but I think as important and rather inaudible was America's complete integration financially, certainly, and economically as well with the rest of the world.
One of the things I discovered in the Coolidge story was how many foreigners came to the White House for dinner. It was one week it was the Queen of Romania, the next week it was Prince of Wales, and so on. And the Coolidges weren't always ready for that. After one of their sons died, they didn't feel like hosting anyone, especially the remaining child, John, didn't feel like being a host at the White House. But the White House usher said, well, he may be the Prince of Wales, but you are the Prince of Plymouth, Vermont, where he came from. You have to do this. And when you delve down, why were all the foreign kings and queens coming? They were coming to get refinanced. And we were doing that. We were lowering their interest rate through Mellon's policy. So I would underscore what Jim is saying. We were trying very hard to help them not go belly up, those European governments, so that the fascists wouldn't take over, right? Basically, that was what Mellon thought he was doing, precluding disaster by giving easier terms to Europeans. That's very important to remember. They thought that their easier policy was there to help Europe.
Well, I think that's a key thing. I mean, during that period, America was becoming the economic leader of the free world. Europe viewed America as sort of a second-class citizen prior to that. And so America really ascended to a position of supremacy on the brink of probably the worst economic period in its history. Jim, do you have any comments on that?
Nope.
Okay. Let's go to the
Jim
other side.
Pasinich. I'm a docent here. My question deals with Herbert Hoover. He was considered by many to be one of the smartest of American presidents. He was Secretary of Commerce and Undersecretary of everything, as you said. Yet in 1929, when the government ran a deficit, he started 1930 by raising taxes and probably exacerbating the economic conditions. Was he too married to 19th century economic policy to be in that position?
Well, to my mind, he was not sufficiently married to 19th century policy in the specific sense of letting markets adjust. He had a very 20th century view, again, sort of my opinion. It might not be the right one, but in my opinion, where he went wrong was giving full vent to his meddlesome ways. He was a Batinsky, and this found expression in his policies immediately after 1929. He insisted, insofar as the president could insist and make that stick, that the country's leading industrialists set an example by not cutting wages. Now, that sounds like the good and humanitarian thing to do. International Harvester in 1920 had instituted about a 35% wage cut, and guys were saying, God, I could starve by not working. Why do I have to starve while working? But wages adjusted with prices, profit margins were restored, and recovery ensued powerfully in 1922 and beyond. Fast forward to 1929, wages did not adjust. Profit margins remained depressed. There was, as Amity so well documented in The Forgotten Man, there was this fear of all manner of political difficulties that froze investment and froze action. And it all started with Hoover. People talked about, in subsequent, looking back on the Hoover administration, they called it the first New Deal. So, and not so concise an answer to your question, I would say that a little heavier dose of the 19th century would have served all of us better.
Well, you just want to remember that we can't be too presentist, as they say. Hoover was not a supply-sider, and he was not a Keynesian either. Both might argue for tax cuts to get growth. But there was a logic to his decision to raise taxes, as unfortunate as it was, which is he didn't want all the gold of America to go over to Europe and force a deep contraction on the U.S. When the gold goes away in a gold standard system, that can force a contraction on a country, a worse recession. So he was following that logic. Coolidge was not a neocon. He didn't like intervention, so he wasn't an isolationist, but he did do a large international treaty because he believed in international law, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which we mock. And I'm not sure we really would if we went back and looked at it. So to the narrow, I agree with Jim on the narrow question, and I don't think the taxes were the worst part of it. It was, Jim and I are both coming to the view that the labor was incredibly important. When you walk away and say, what's new in economics? For me, what was new when I wrote these books was the labor price mattered a lot. And when you force employers to raise wages, they do lay people off. And when you don't force them to raise wages, they lower wages. And as sad as it was at International Harvester, it's always better to have a job that's less well paid than no job, or to have a rigidity so that you cannot penetrate into the working area. So I would say that's the worst of Hoover, not the taxes, unhappy as it makes the Wall Street Journal.
So let's fast forward to contemporary times. We're talking now about raising the minimum wage. We have 7.6% of the 6.6% of the population unemployed. We have 13% of the population partially employed with a part-time job that would like a full-time job. Is it the right thing? I mean, don't we have a parallel circumstance now where we're talking about raising the minimum wage to over $10 at a time when we have so many people unemployed? We're trying to control the compensation of workers at a time when we're also trying to put more people on the payrolls. Isn't this going to have a counterproductive effect? Jim?
Yes. The great Frédéric Bastiat was a French economist of 19th century. And he had an idea that he goes, that which is seen, that which is unseen. And I'm going to read you a couple of sentences of Bastiat that speaks to such well-intended policies as the higher minimum wage. Quote, in the economy, an act, a habit, an institution, a law gives birth not only to an effect, but to a series of effects. Of these effects, the first only is immediate. It manifests itself simultaneously with its cause. It is seen. The others unfold in succession. They are not seen. It is well for us if they are foreseen. So the minimum wage, it sounds great. Why should people laboring or shoveling snow at LaGuardia Airport not earn enough money to live on? Let's give them a raise. Let's have a minimum wage at which people can live with dignity. That's good. That sounds good. But that is what is seen. What is unseen, the succession of effects after the imposition of the wage. And especially deleterious are these ideas, or these policies, in an economy that is stagnant, or largely 2% in America, I say, is stagnant. So the underlying problem to me is not the minimum wage, it's the lack of dynamism. When you have a growing economy, a minimum wage job is the first job. It lasts a year, 2 years, 6 months. It's a stepping stone. It teaches you how to work. It teaches you how to show up and work in the morning and how to operate within an organization. It's temporary. The trouble lies with a permanent minimum wage job, and that is not the problem of a minimum wage. That's the problem with ossification. It's the problem with no growth and with a fear of no growth for a long time.
Amity, you want to chime in on this?
Well, you just want to look at it as a whole. What makes it expensive to hire someone, or hard? Will I hire? So beyond the minimum wage, it might be a rule or a mandate. Once we wrote an editorial, actually at the Journal, where I see Mrs. Bartley in the room, where it was called the 49th job because there was some rule or other that affected the way you employ at 50. And it was about companies that always only employed up to 49 for that reason. And we all do this now individually. And it's not just because we're selfish, it's because we're trying to keep our company alive. So it's not just the wage, which is the headline, it's also the rules that go along with employment that can impede recovery.
Okay. Over here.
Previous question. Of what effect did the Dawes Act have regarding international trade and dealing with the problems of reparations for Germany, and how did such an act affect the American economy throughout the 1920s?
In a most cowardly way, Amity Shlaes is telling me I should answer this. I haven't got a clue.
We haven't got a clue. We don't know.
I'm sorry, so your question is much more erudite than my...
So that's the law that made the Dawes Plan?
Dawes Plan, yeah. I mean, I know that it was an act intended to smooth out the payment schedule for foreign debts, but beyond, I mean, this is not even a halfway decent description, but if you give me about 2 or 3 days, I'm going to get back with an answer. but thank you.
Okay. Should we go over here?
Wasn't agriculture a much more important part of the economy in the 20s? And did the agricultural recession or depression of that era have follow-on effects or increase the instability of that period?
Yes, indeed.
Yes, indeed.
I think everyone in America, 1920, for example, was a farmer or knew one. Agriculture was no longer the dominant industry in America, but it was a substantial secondary industry. I've forgotten the percentages now, but it must have been in the order of 15% or so, or 20% of GDP. And commodity prices collapsed in the deflation, and they remained low in good part thanks to the mechanization of agriculture that was part and parcel of the internal combustion revolution that brought us the automobile. The new thing under the sun in the 20s was the farmer businessman, the mechanized farmer, much more productive, much more efficient. In consequence, the agricultural sector shrank in many ways, and not least in the troubles that were visited upon very small country banks in farming districts that failed in large numbers during the 20s in the midst of an overall bout of prosperity in urban America. So the farming sector was in its very efficiency became a source of social difficulty and of economic drag for people involved in it.
Amity, do you want to comment on that?
Wait, if you would go and teach it at a university, you'd say all the things that Jim Grant said, but you'd add a little bit of focus on unit banking, which is it's a wonderful life. There's a town bank. It has no other friends. It's dependent on one industry, agriculture, and it fails when bad news comes from out east, when money's tight, when the crop fails. And politicians made the unit banks. There was a rule that said they couldn't be in some great chain or network, right? We live, and gradually that became undone, but not in the 20s. They just weren't part of a system. So when we teach it, we correlate where are their unit banks, and you can see that farms fail there. Their bank fails with them, everybody goes down together. That's a policy change you could have.
I think that this whole situation, minimum wage situation, has to be understood in the context of where American business is today. When we had the recession of 2008-9, the corporations began to pull out of it with a lot of cash on their balance sheet. They use that cash on their balance sheet, especially manufacturers, to buy capital equipment that allowed them to get the goods and services out the door with fewer workers. Robotic equipment and other labor-saving devices were used. It was just easier to buy a piece of equipment than it was to hire a worker back. So that's sort of what we're going through with American business right now, and we're talking about raising the minimum wage in the face of that.
Well, that's one of the unintended consequences of ultra-low interest rates, is that the capital is being substituted for labor.
Okay, over here.
Thank you. I'm curious about one social change that occurred in the 1920s that hasn't been mentioned at all. And maybe it had no impact, but I'd be curious about your opinion. And that's the women's suffrage. The electorate dramatically expanded during the 1920s because women got the right to vote in national elections. They also began to enter the paid labor force during that decade in some numbers. And I'm curious to know whether you think that that had any impact at all on the overall development of the economy.
Either of you.
So you, Amity.
So it's so me, right? I think it was good. If you,
You want to go further?
no. There's a wonderful complaining article by a math major who is married to a smart guy. She wrote an article in the New Republic about how she ever ended up being a housewife. How did it happen? One day she was sitting in her happy seminar, and the next year she was a housewife with a baby because she got married, and all the things she had to do, she just couldn't believe it. The washing alone, all morning it was washing, and in the afternoon the iron and the fire and steaming and getting burned, and the baby might get burned. What hell she was in, a smart girl who ended up being married. And what she was doing was writing an article about a home keeping pre-electricity. And then so all these things came in, and of course they could go out, and women, because of World War I, and because women had to fill jobs, men were away. We learned women could drive. That's wonderful. Coolidge didn't really think women should drive, but they could, and they did. So that was a great freedom, and I think it's quite important in terms of creativity to have that input from women. But I don't have data for you.
Jim?
Oh, no, I think Emily said it very well.
That's about as hard as a doll's plan.
Okay, is there anyone over there? Yeah.
Hi.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes. Question. The First Lady who spoke asked about how did radio affect the economy at the time. I have a lot of questions, but I'll just make it very short. Now it seems that everything is interrelated. The internet, even cybersecurity. Our banking system could go if we have problems as far as cybersecurity is concerned. Yes, I see that things are very similar. You can draw comparisons, but now my question is, how dangerous is it really? Because we are so interconnected. I can buy stock at Fidelity, and I do. I don't need a broker. And as far as social change, it's changing everywhere, here and abroad. And, as much as we were the same, the problems seem to be larger now. And what's your thought?
Well, I would say, ma'am, that the problems always seem large. And I'm not sure if we are more beset today with the difficulties arising from our very own ingenuity than were our forefathers and foremothers. The doctors in the late teens and 20s had a lot to cope with in the great influenza pandemic. And I see my wife, the physician, sitting right, she's going to prompt me, but one of the medical journals talked about the automobile. And they coined a medical term to describe fatalities on the highway. Bacillus automobilis was. Anyway, so there was a terrific apprehension about the destruction that this thing would wreak on our lives. So I recall in my work on Thomas B. Reed, a Speaker of the House in the late 19th century. That there were many similar apprehensions concerning the innovations of that day. So I grew up. I think Amity did not grow up as young as she is, but I grew up as a schoolboy in the 1950s in Long Island with duck and cover. The Russians were going to nuke us, and we had to climb under our desks, and that was a source of apprehension. I think that every age has its own, and ours probably are not much different than the ones that preceded them.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. You mentioned earlier that one of the things contributing, or at least leading up to the crash, was the country's distrust of President Harding and his administration. Right? Did I hear that correctly?
Which crash, sir?
It was the Teapot Dome you mentioned, because he put all his...
Well, that came after the Depression that I mentioned began in January 1920. That was an election year, and Woodrow Wilson was still in office.
Right.
And the official trough was in July of 1921, and the Harding administration was only 3 or 4 months old. So Harding had nothing to do with the onset of the Depression, and I'm not sure how much he did with the recovery from it, but he's certainly not to blame for it.
Oh, no, I thought you mentioned it in your...
I probably did.
I mentioned that Harding hurt political trust.
Yes.
But he did not, I don't have much evidence he hurt the economy.
Okay.
Or that erosion of political trust in that instance hurt the economy.
So you wouldn't compare that with today's situation where it's safe to say the country distrusts the administration and the president, including, very importantly, the IRS situation.
Right. Well, here's where trust matters. If you want to undertake difficult legislation, such as Social Security reform, Medicare reform, if you want to veto veterans who are in pain, you need the trust of the polity. And so Harding was unable, had he lived, this is a counterfactual, had he lived, he would have been unable to do some things he wanted to do. Continue to cut tax rates was a plan for his party. He didn't know if he could do it because he didn't have political trust and he was mired in scandal. So it's related in that way. Coolidge was able to promulgate or veto as he chose, and some of us would argue that was to the benefit of the country because he had trust, but it's not so direct.
Is what you're getting at the Affordable Care Act?
Well,
what does he want?
But as important is the IRS, because we're talking about the crash. So
the IRS didn't cause. The IRS was a subject. It didn't cause the crash. It was the subject of incredible political controversy in the 20s, and I discovered this in researching Coolidge. The tax cutters really wanted a tax cut, but the progressives really didn't want to give it to them, right? It was just like now. So one of the things they had to trade to get their tax cut was that the tax returns of individuals could be put on the wall at the post office. That was legal. And that gave all the news reporters material, Mr. Ween's return. And so, yes, it was subject of great controversy, but why do you think the IRS caused the crash?
No, I didn't say they caused the crash. I was trying to, as Byron was saying, if you can equate it to today with the distrust of the administration, right. I mean, because you are both knowledgeable, I'd like to know, do you see any connection with that?
Well,
what could happen now?
What could happen is we will fail to... Social Security is something that can be reformed in one afternoon. And most of us would agree to the terms. Well, let's make everyone get what his older brother got, adjusted for inflation. That's a good share of it. Let's have some very highly educated immigrants pay a little money when they come in and work for Google. Done. It's not hard to do. You can even grandfather poor people so they get money under the old system. Because of the absence of political trust, because the Republican Party poses too much with privatization, because the Democratic Party treats Social Security like a holy cow, we don't reform this important program. Does that solve our whole fiscal problem? Of course not at all. Social Security is minor relative to Medicare and so on. However, it would be an enormous trust builder in itself if we did agree on a Social Security reform. So the absence of trust is keeping our economy hostage. I do believe that. Maybe Jim doesn't.
No,
I mean, that's a good
keeping
example.
our economy hostage, and it's keeping the government immobile.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more. Is there one over there?
Right. Question for Mr. Grant. You mentioned and you emphasized that today we have socialized risk much more than risk was socialized 90 years ago. I'm surprised that you're not emphasizing more that today we do not have a gold standard, but 90 years ago we did. Should we emphasize more the effects on the economy of not having the gold standard?
Well, we only had a 90-minute program. So. I think that I happen to think that that the current monetary regime, which is an improvisational situation. You know, we call it grants. We call it the PhD standard. Very smart people sit around and decide what should happen with respect to the all-important level of interest rates. Now, to me, this is a huge anachronism. This is command and control. The social media, for example, are all about collaboration. So to me, this is kind of Romania 1954, this thing with the FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee. So you ask about the gold standard. The gold standard is a decentralized, market-driven monetary regime. And yes, I am for it. And if given 2 or 3 hours, I could hold forth, but we are constrained. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, I mean, I can't believe it. I thought my career would last longer than the gold standard question, but I guess it is. Okay, well, we're going to conclude there. I want to thank Jim and Amity. Thanks very much to all of you for coming.
You're watching American History TV all weekend, every weekend on C-SPAN 30.